Today, I'm going to present this topic, assessing the implications of CO2 emission tax in Malaysia using a developed environmental input-output model. In 2018, world energy-related CO2 emissions rose to a historic high of 33.1 gigatons CO2 in parts of the robust world economy. CO2 emissions are double since the early 70s and rose by around 40% since 2000, according to International Energy Agency 2019. High economic growth rate in the country often associates with the large consumption of commercial energy. Malaysia's CO2 emission rate was recorded 6.93 metric tons per capita or 0.63 kg per GDP. These statistics are relatively higher compared to Thailand and Indonesia. Developing countries, including Malaysia, face the difficulty to meet the emission standard as per the Paris Agreement. The positive trend of CO2 emission and energy demand during 1978 to 2016 registered a constant growth trend over the years in Malaysia. High growth of energy demand was largely achieved in transportation sector, followed by the industrial sector, non-energy sector, residential and commercial sector, and the agriculture sector. It is expected that rising CO2 emissions would continue along economic growth in Malaysia. In the 15th Conference of the Parties in Copenhagen, Malaysia submitted a voluntary pledge of reducing carbon emission intensity of GDP by 2020 to 40% compared to the 2005 levels. Being an official member in the Kyoto Protocol in 2002, many projects in Malaysia have been registered as Clean Development Mechanism projects. Malaysian Cabinet approved the National Green Technology and Climate Change Council in 2009 for providing a framework concerning climate resilient development. A master plan on green technology was then drafted by the ministry with detailed guidelines for companies to decrease carbon intensity by 40% by 2020. Imposing a carbon taxation system has been recognized as one of the remedies to prevent deterioration of climate change. In literature, carbon tax have been proposed to combat the negative externality of carbon emissions in order to establish a more socially efficient level of consumption. Previous studies on Malaysian case agree that CO2 emission is getting worse, and the recent studies highlight the possibilities of imposing two environmental tax policies, which were carbon and energy tax. Solar money showed that carbon tax policy has reduced CO2 emission. Carbon tax were found more effective than the energy tax for Malaysia. Imposing carbon tax raised energy costs, which will consequently increase expenditure in production of goods and services. Low-income households would suffer from increase in energy bills. So the cost of a living after imposing carbon tax may be the next challenge in Malaysia. We developed an environmentally extended input-output table to assess the impact of carbon taxation on Malaysian economy. Its impacts cover production price, consumption price, household welfare, and government revenue. The Malaysian EEIO was extracted from the oral global multi-regional input-output tables. And this is the MRIO table that we mean in the text. The Malaysian EEIO table in previous slide was then used to identify the potential impact of CO2 taxation in the Malaysian economy using the Leontief price model. We incorporate direct and indirect CO2 intensity so that we can link CO2 emissions to energy intensity of production price, private welfare, and public revenues. This equation assesses the environment tax for each sector. This equation then defines the total cost of intermediate input and value-added expenditure by sectors. We further compute the impact of CO2 emission tax on the cost change of sector J. After that, we reflect the impact of CO2 emission tax on the cost structure of each sector in matrix notation. A star is the new technical coefficient matrix that incorporates the energy tax, and V is the vector of value added per unit of output. Based on our result, we first picture the top 10 large producers of CO2 emissions. The highest CO2 emissions was from the public administration sector with 89 million per metric ton CO2. Transportation was the second largest contribution of CO2 emission, which is 79 million per metric ton. There was a growing concern over the reliance on petroleum products that cover petrol and diesel, particularly in road transport. The third highest CO2 emission sector is the electricity, gas, and water sector, which is 51 million per metric ton CO2 that consume a lot of fossil fuels such as oil, coal, and natural gas. Our second set of results show the top 10 highest CO2 emission intensities in Malaysia based on per unit of output in productivity and technology efficiency as well as economic activities. Considering direct and indirect emissions, building and construction sector has the highest emission intensity, which ranks 7 large producers of CO2 emissions in the previous figure. The second and third highest CO2 emission intensities are transportation and electricity, gas, and water sectors. Our results further show that carbon tax can be levied on the building and construction sector with a 4.23% tax rate, the transportation with a 3.19% tax rate, and the electricity, gas, and water sector with a 3.03% tax rate. After this, we simulate the scenarios of imposing carbon tax on Case 1, building and construction sector with 4.23%, Case 2, transportation sector with 3.19%, Case 3, electricity, gas, and water sector with 3.03%. These figures show the 5 sectors that most vulnerable to the carbon tax in those cases, which are the public administration, metal, manufacturing product, transportation, as well as food and drinks with different rates of change in the production price. To illustrate, the introduction of carbon tax of 4.23% in Case 1 create the greatest private welfare loss with a reduction of 4.23% compared to Case 2 and Case 3. Nevertheless, high tax on Case 1 would create the greatest public revenues with a collection of up to USD 4393 million compared to Case 2 and Case 3. Note that introducing carbon tax favors the less polluting sectors. those high polluting sectors would struggle to reduce emissions. The effect of the carbon tax was then reflected on the production costs through the market signals. The other sectors are also indirectly affected as the result of interaction among the sectors. A general increase in production price would raise consumer price. The social welfare was therefore negatively affected, where individual real incomes were reduced. Therefore, an appropriate design of carbon tax would remain a cost-effective strategy to meet the restriction on emission. However, we suggest that the tax collections can be used to stimulate market innovation or other distribution schemes for better social welfare. That's all for my presentation today. Thank you.